One of my favorite writers is a man named Fred Reed. Perhaps some of you read the essays that appear by him on LouRockwell.com from time to time. And he had one a while back, last May actually. This one was called Why the U.S. Government is Hated All Over the World. Fred is an American who moved to Mexico. He lives in Guadalajara, and he's married to a Mexican woman. And so he has an interesting perspective on life in this country because he knows it intimately, I assure you. Fred's a remarkably well-informed man, just astonishingly well-informed sometimes. But he lives far away most of the time. He comes back from time to time. And one of the points he made in this article was to say that a curious state of fear prevails in America, but it is a governmental creation, a calculated, manipulative Disneyland. He said, recently I was in Washington. Everywhere there were the artificialities of fear, the steel pop-up barriers in the roads, the stop-'em bombs, steel poles on the sidewalks, the endless warnings to report suspicious behavior on loudspeakers in the subway, the searches of everything, the metal detecting doorways, even on the buildings of county governments, of schools. Schools, for Christ's sake, what is wrong here? And of course, the confiscation of shampoo at the airport. And then Fred says in his characteristic way, this is nuts. Right? Look at how we're acting here. We're all acting as if we're under siege. Look at what we're doing to one another. You'd think there was a danger out there. And he also makes reference to the bullying of people entering the U.S. And he told a little bit about his wife, Violetta. Violetta had a visa issued by the consulate both times when we went to the U.S. Still, she got bullied by the border Nazis. It was ugly. I am obviously not a Mexican, but I get the same hostile questioning as to where I'm going, why I was in Mexico, and so on. It is none of their business where I go in my country, or shouldn't be. But there are no limitations on governmental powers now. A friend married to a Mexicana, again with a visa, got separated from her, and both got abusive questioning, and she came out crying. America was not like this. Now it is. Okay? And I think Fred is absolutely right. It wasn't like this, and now it is, and it's this way everywhere we go. I live in a small town, or outside a small town in southeast Louisiana, and I can't go into my damn courthouse without passing through a bunch of armed men who make me partially disrobe and glare at me and menace me and threaten me to empty my pockets. You know, what is going on here? What is going on here? Do they really think Osama bin Laden is going to mount an attack on the St. Tammany Parish Courthouse? It's absurd, and yet people tolerate this. As Fred noted, it doesn't happen by accident. An atmosphere of fear normally might occur after, say, the events of 9/11. People might have been afraid, but that fear would have dissipated. It would have worn away, and people would have eventually realized that it's not being repeated. Maybe it was a one-time thing. Probably there's no big threat. That's what tends to happen when some terrible thing happens once and then it doesn't happen again. People don't remain fearful forever because they were scared once upon a time. Okay? But our fears in this country have been revitalized over and over. I ran across an interesting report, actually not too long ago, in November the 1st this year. which had to do with Donald Rumsfeld's operating style when he was the Secretary of Defense. Rumsfeld enjoyed barraging his subordinates with little memos. They referred to these things as snowflakes, Rumsfeld's snowflakes, and he was always dumping them on people as a way to goad them to go in certain directions or take care of certain things. You know, this sounds like the kind of foolish thing that one would learn as an MBA student. There's always some kind of fad in business, you know. So now this year, the MBA students are told to send out snowflakes to subordinates. But Rumsfeld, wherever he got this, did it all the time. And in April 2006, when he was under siege because a series of retired generals had denounced him and called for his resignation in newspaper op-ed pieces, Rumsfeld produced a memo after a conference he called with military analysts, and it said, quote, "Talk about Somalia, the Philippines, etc. Make the American people realize they are surrounded in the world by violent extremists." End quote. Now think about that. Here's a very high-ranking official of the federal government who sent his subordinates out to make the American people realize that they are surrounded in the world by violent extremists. We all know that there are people in the world who are interested in committing acts of terrorism. There's some here and some over there, and you know they're scattered around. There may still be a couple in Hamburg, and there are probably a few hundred in Pakistan and so forth. We know there are people out there who would like to commit acts of terrorism, but isn't that a far cry in a world of 6 billion people from thinking that we are surrounded by violent extremists? That seems to me to call up very different imagery from my own personal appreciation of how many terrorists there are out there and how big a threat they pose to me. Frankly, my appreciation of the threat they pose to me in person is so close to zero, I consider it zero. You know, it's obviously possible I would be harmed by a terrorist, but the odds are 0.000 whatever. Right? It's not worth thinking about. It's certainly not at the level of thinking about how carefully you're going to drive when you leave here tonight. That's a much greater threat to your well-being than terrorism's ever going to be. But we've got a government that wants us to worry about being surrounded by terrorists. And I think some people have actually, as a result of being bombarded by these kinds of warnings, come to actually be afraid of terrorism and to alter some of their behaviors as a result of that fear. Now, there are a great many public fears that we might take notice of. And when I talk about fear here tonight, I'm not talking about every kind of fear. I'm not talking about my personal fear that y'all are going to laugh at me because I'm a poor speaker, or Pedro's fear that Maria will turn down his marriage proposal. I'm talking about the kinds of fears that are widely shared by many people in the public, the sort of classes of fear. And I just made a small list of these things to use in my presentation tonight. And it includes death or injury at the hands of foreigners, death or injury by terrorists, whether foreign or domestic, death or injury because of environmental harm of some kind. Perhaps some of you have heard of something called anthropogenic global warming. Admit it, you've heard of it. See, and that's going to all fry us all in short order, and so forth. People fear loss of labor earnings because of unemployment, loss of income or capital from investments, loss of life or health from communicable disease, loss of income or social respect because of some form of discrimination, loss of cultural or language community, perhaps because of a so-called invasion of immigrants, harm from unsafe foods, medicines, or medical devices, loss of business income, destitution in old age, illness or injury in old age. I'm sure I could have extended this list, but you get the idea. There are quite a number of things that people are afraid of or apprehensive about that many people are afraid of. These are widespread. They're public fears. And the state then comes along and promises to allay the threats that go with these fears. They say, look, I'm from the government and I'm here to help you. And in fact, I'm here to help you by protecting you from the things that you're afraid of. They know the things we're most afraid of. Politicians don't know a lot, but they know something about people. They get out and press the flesh and listen to what people complain about. So if we're afraid of death or injury by foreigners, they provide national defense. And they want to spend quite a lot of money to do that because that's a big job. Death or injury by terrorists, that calls for a global war on terror. Right? And when we've killed the last terrorist, the war will be won. Right? I don't know. People take these things seriously. They're done in politics. Guys stand up on the floor of the Senate and talk about this with a straight face. I've seen it. Death or injury because of environmental harms? Well, we have an abundance of environmental controls to save us from those kinds of threats. Loss of labor earnings because of unemployment? The government provides unemployment insurance and all kinds of welfare for the unemployed. Loss of labor earnings because of an accident on the job? We have workers' compensation insurance and other ways. We have even vocational rehabilitation if people get hurt on the job. We have loss of income from capital or capital from investments. Well, the government has thousands of subsidies and bailouts to keep that wolf from the door. Loss of life from health from communicable disease. We have public health measures and health care insurance of different kinds. And before long, we'll have national health insurance in this country. Won't that be droll? Huh? That'll be really nice. People will love that. I guarantee it. Loss of income or social respect because of discrimination? Well, we have anti-discrimination laws to protect people from that. Loss of cultural or language community? We got the border controls for that and immigration restrictions and related things. Unsafe foods, medicines, and medical devices. The government has provided us with the Food and Drug Administration and other public health measures to save us from those harms. Loss of business income, oh, that's a doozy. Businessmen are afraid of losing income, so the government has provided tariffs, anti-competitive regulations, import quotas, price supports, tax breaks, licensing. It's hard to stop myself because there are a great many more things the government has provided basically to prevent businessmen from losing income that they would lose if the government didn't intervene and they had to simply make their way in the market unaided. Destitution in old age, well, the government gives us Social Security pensions. Illness or injury in old age, Medicare. And, if I'd made a longer list, I could have matched everything with a government program that's going to take care of the harm hooked to the fear that people have. So the government knows we're afraid of things, and it's made it its business to relieve us of those fears. Now, I think about fears in several different general classifications, and I'm going to back up a little bit now and as it were, retrace the development of this phenomenon. One thing we may be afraid of is the government itself. I know I am. Obviously, a lot of people are afraid of some parts of the government, like the IRS. I've never met anyone who welcomes an audit. Or people may be afraid of genuine threats. I've been sarcastic here and mocking some of this, but there are real dangers in the world. There are real threats that people face, and people may look to government to deal with these threats. And thirdly, they may look to government to deal with threats which are spurious and may actually have been concocted or created or publicized by the government, even though they're not real or not serious. So there are certain classes of fears, but the point I want to make is that it doesn't matter what kind of fear we're talking about here among the public. Governments exploit all of them, whether they're real, spurious, or even of the government itself. Now, governments, people like to think sometimes that governments were formed when people realized that we needed government, that without government we'd have these problems we couldn't deal with involving public goods or externalities and so forth. That's the way economists talk about this. And so the philosophers used to think that they got together and they formed a social compact. And sometimes you'll read essays by journalists and they still make reference to the social compact as if there were one. You can't do that. That violates the social compact. Well, what compact? I didn't sign this thing. Did you? What is this? So that isn't really how governments came into being. Okay? For most of human history, there were no governments in the sense we know about them at all. There were just little groups of related people. That's all. That maybe 20, 30, probably usually no more than 70 or 80 people. And these little bands roamed around in the savannah, and they hunted things to eat, and they had a little bit of authority, like family authority. There might have been some, the oldest guy who knew a little more than the younger ones, and they might have looked to him for direction or something, but there wasn't anything like we think of as government through most of human history. And what we actually think of as government didn't develop probably until what we think of as civilization began to develop. They occurred together, although most people are confused about the direction of causation. The civilization actually came before the governments, and then the governments came along to as it were, exploit the civilization. Governments originated in conquest and subjugation. They originated when people came into conflict, and instead of just running away, as they probably did for many millions of years, because that made more sense than fighting with people, just go somewhere else and don't get hurt. There's a big world out there, and there are only a handful of human beings, so let's not fight over one spot here. Let's go to a different part of the savannah. But eventually people got thickly enough populated in certain places and resources sufficiently inviting that people did begin to fight with one another. And some of them were successful in suppressing groups and conquering and subjugating them and exploiting them. They might enslave the people they conquered, or they might simply take all the goods that the conquered people possessed, their foodstuffs or what have you. So governments were, in their beginning, just simple bands of robbers. But there's a difference between robbers in the sense of what we call roving bandits They go here and there. They find somebody who has something they think worth stealing, and they take it, and they move on. And government is what Mansur Olson refers to as the stationary bandit. Okay? He's the bandit who's not satisfied to take what you have and then go somewhere else. He takes what you have, and he stays there. And he says, and I want more tomorrow. Or I want more next year, and the year after that, and the year after that. So the stationary bandit doesn't leave you. Now, subjugated people, for good reason, feared for their lives. Often, many of them were killed in the process of being subjugated. So they knew they were up against it. And if the conquerors gave them a choice, pay tribute or we'll kill you, they knew that the conquerors meant business, and so very often they chose to pay and to keep paying rather than be killed. So this is the sense in which people respond to government and pay tribute to it because they're afraid of it. They're afraid of it. In this sense, government is not anything like a genuine protector. It's a protection racket, you see, because the mafia, when it comes around and says, we'll protect you, what they mean is, we'll hurt you if you don't pay us. Your protection money is protection from us, pal. And, of course, if somebody tries to horn in on their territory, they may commit mayhem against the intruders too. So this is one original sense in which government uses fear, literally by threatening people's lives. Now that's good, of course, but it doesn't work well for long, because when you treat people like that, they resent it, and they look for ways either to diminish the amount that they're coughing up to you or to somehow hurt you, to sabotage your whole exploitative operation. If they have a chance to overthrow you or kill you, they take it. So this is not a good deal for the stationary bandit. There are better ways to operate, more reliable ones, easier ones. But to move out of this stage, governments need legitimacy. They need for people to believe that they're not just being robbed, but that the tribute they pay is right and proper, and that it ought to go to these rulers. In order to gain legitimacy, governments historically, and probably almost from the very beginning, joined forces with the priests. As far back as we know anything about governments, say the Egyptians, some of the early civilizations of the area the U.S. Armed Forces now occupy, in these places, the rulers were themselves considered to be gods. And so, the people were in awe of them. They believed that these rulers, being gods, had powers that ordinary human beings don't have, and those powers could be used against them. So they were awed. They were made to believe that the rulers were not simply human beings exploiting them, but they were superhuman in some fashion. And eventually, this kind of joining the priesthood to the warrior class, a uniting of throne and altar, served to legitimate the rulers. They didn't always claim to be gods. Sometimes, especially later on, they claimed only to be appointed by God or blessed by God or descended from God. There are all kinds of ways of linking rulers to gods. I was struck by a speech I ran across given by Kaiser Wilhelm to the German troops in World War I, in which he emphasized that Germany was the people chosen by God and that he was God's appointed leader, and that this was a divine war in which they were engaged, because it seemed anachronistic. See, wow, here we are, 1914, 1915, and they're still using this kind of ruler-God link in a blatant way. But it lasted a long time, the union of throne and altar, and in some ways it still exists. I don't know anybody who believes that George W. Bush is a god, but there apparently are a lot of people who believe that somehow he's divinely appointed. He says he thinks that, and other people, in the evangelical religious groups seem to think that as well. They've given very strong support to Bush and his wars, thinking that he's on a mission from God. Now, that worked throughout most of history, to get legitimacy from linking yourself to some divine source or mission. But rulers also found it helpful if they could make people believe that they were actually the protectors of the people rather than the exploiters of the people. And so they began fairly early to work at that. Now, that can get very confusing, because it's pretty clear that sometimes they are protecting the people. If invaders came into the area, they would often, sure enough, go out and try to get rid of them and defeat them and drive them away. And that certainly looks, at first glance, like protecting the people. But it was protecting the people in the same sense that a shepherd drives away the wolf from his flock. Yeah, he protects his sheep. But the shepherd does not recognize that the sheep have any rights. And indeed, he believes and acts on the belief that when it suits his purposes, he will shear or slaughter the sheep at his pleasure. Still, in the meantime, it makes sense to protect them. So he drives away the wolves. So rulers have done that for a long time, and it led people to the misapprehension that the rulers really cared about them, that they wanted to protect them. They were devoted to protecting them, when they were basically just protecting their sources of income. The stationary bandit not only protects people from foreign invasion and sometimes domestic disorder as well, but he may invest in what economists call public goods. He may keep order. He may establish some kind of legal regime. He may stipulate rules that are useful. He may say, we all drive on the right-hand side of the road in this realm, and it's good to have a rule. Okay? He may build roads and bridges and dams and other things that are useful to people and help them become more productive. But again, people have been led to believe that rulers do these things because they have the people's interest in heart. But there's an easy rule the rulers can follow for whether it's in their interest to invest in public goods, and that is whether the additional productivity of the people that results from these investments will yield them a greater stream of tribute sufficient to justify the current cost of investing in public goods. So, you can do this formally and compute present values and everything. I'm not supposing that Charlemagne did this, but I believe he understood the principle. And indeed, rulers for a very long time have understood the principle. The reason you invest in measures to make people more productive is because it will yield you more tribute. That's always been the case. To do otherwise is to strangle the goose that's laying the golden egg for you. That's stupid. Okay? Now, of course, rulers that have a very loose grip on power, you'll notice as you look around the world, don't do much of this. It's the rulers who have a very strong grip on power that have the confidence that if they give up income today that they could seize and use some of their tribute to invest in public goods to make people more productive, that they'll be around in future to get the payoff from those people's greater productivity. So you find in a country like the United States or a Western European country, governments invest in lots of public goods, whereas in a country like Bolivia, Paraguay, or Burundi, not so much, because the rulers don't have as strong a grip there, and it's not in their interest to refrain from simply looting people while they can loot, get away with it. Now, this protection that rulers promise people is often bunk anyhow, and you see that bunk by one way you see it is by looking at the bunkers. I'm not making this up.